the world has always had its powerful players, those who set the rules and those expected to follow them. For decades, the balance of power was tilted in one direction. The West dictated, and others responded. Among those often placed under pressure, sanctioned, and targeted was Iran, painted as a threat, a problem, a country to contain. But behind the headlines and political noise, something deeper was building, a quiet resistance, a determination that didn't make the evening news, until one moment changed everything. That moment wasn't loud in the traditional sense. There were no screaming headlines from Western leaders admitting shock. But the silence said it all. Iran had made its move, not just with military strength, but with bold defiance, and the world noticed. What followed wasn't chaos, but clarity. Suddenly, everything people assumed about Iran, its power, and its position in the global order had to be re-evaluated. This was no longer the Iran that could be pushed into a corner. This was a nation standing tall, not in arrogance, but in sovereignty. People across the world watched, some in awe, others in confusion. How did a nation so heavily sanctioned, so isolated by global powers, suddenly take center stage and force a pause in the usual flow of events? The answer was in the resolve, the type of strength that isn't only measured in weapons or speeches, but in identity, belief, and unity. Iran's defiance wasn't a random act of aggression. It was a statement rooted in years of restraint, pressure, and silence. A statement that said, "We will not be broken." This moment became a mirror for many, especially those living under the shadow of similar powers. It asked a deep question: what does it mean to be truly independent in a world that punishes those who think differently? Iran's answer was action, not loud for the sake of being loud, but deliberate and undeniable. In that silence after the strike, in that calm before the political storm, something shifted. Iran had spoken in a language the world couldn't ignore, and as millions tuned in, some for politics, some for drama, others found something else, a sense of respect for a nation that refused to kneel. This wasn't just a political event, it was a signal. The old world order isn't unshakable, and in the face of calculated pressure, there are still those willing to rise, to resist, and to redefine what power truly looks like. For years, the relationship between Iran and the West had been defined by one-sided narratives. Sanctions, threats, isolation. These were the tools used to pressure a nation into submission. But the world rarely questioned what was happening behind Iran's borders. Away from the political headlines, there was a growing frustration, not just among officials, but within the people. A sense that their country was being cornered, demonized, and denied its right to exist with dignity on the world stage. This tension simmered for years, and while Iran remained patient, the pressure kept mounting. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. A move by the West or its regional allies, whether military, political, or economic, forced Iran to choose between further silence or firm response. And this time, silence was no longer an option. The world expected the usual, statements of condemnation, perhaps diplomatic protests. But Iran didn't follow the expected script. It acted with precision, with calculation, and with purpose. This wasn't a reckless retaliation. It was a signal. The strike or statement that followed was not just about defense. It was about reclaiming the right to stand. Iran wasn't just answering back. It was rewriting the rules. And what made the world pause wasn't just the act itself, but the calm confidence behind it. There was no panic, no desperation, only clarity. For the first time in years, Iran's response wasn't shaped by fear of repercussions. It was shaped by principle. People across the globe watched closely. Allies, enemies, and neutral observers all found themselves asking the same question: what changed? The answer wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about resolve. Iran had decided it would no longer let its destiny be dictated by others. It would engage the world on its own terms. This moment shattered the illusion that Iran could be endlessly pushed without reaction. It reminded global powers that even under immense pressure, a nation rooted in conviction cannot be easily bent. This was more than news. It was a reminder that power is not always about dominance. Sometimes, it's about the courage to resist, to speak when silence is expected, and to act when the world assumes you won't. Iran had just reminded the world that it is not a passive player. It is a nation with a voice. And now, everyone was listening. As the dust settled from Iran's unexpected response, the world took a collective breath. For decades, global politics had operated on the assumption that certain countries would always obey and others would always command. But this moment shattered that illusion. Iran's move wasn't just about defending itself. It was about redefining its place in the global narrative. The message was clear: Iran would no longer operate under the shadow of fear or subjugation. Instead, it was stepping forward, no longer as a victim of foreign policy, but as a nation unafraid to assert its voice. What made the moment even more significant was the calculated nature of the defiance. It wasn't chaotic, impulsive, or reckless. It was strategic, measured, and deeply symbolic. Iran didn't seek to escalate blindly. It sought to be understood. In a world where military and political might often dominate conversations, Iran's act was about presence, not just power. It demonstrated that dignity matters, that a nation can be proud without being aggressive, firm without being fanatical. And in doing so, Iran challenged more than just geopolitical strategy. It challenged the very perception of strength. True power, Iran seemed to say, lies not in how loudly you speak, but in how clearly you act. Across the region and beyond, leaders were stunned. Not because they hadn't anticipated some form of reaction, but because they hadn't expected one so confident. For years, Iran had been portrayed as reactive, boxed in by global pressure. But this time, it wasn't reacting, it was leading. This shift was seismic. It altered not only how Iran was perceived, but how other nations might view their own roles in a world dominated by a few voices. Suddenly, smaller or sanctioned nations saw a path, a reminder that resistance, when guided by clarity and courage, can still make waves. Iran's actions weren't just about retaliation, they were about reclaiming agency. For the first time in a long time, the balance of narrative began to tip. Iran was no longer just a subject in other people's headlines, it was the headline itself. And as the world watched, many began to realize that this moment would be studied, remembered, and perhaps even repeated. Because something had changed, not just in policy, but in perception. Iran had defied not just the West, but the limits others had placed upon it. The silence from Western leaders after Iran's bold response spoke louder than any official statement. It wasn't just a political move that caught them off guard, it was a shift in psychological power. For decades, Iran had been boxed into a narrative created by others. It was labeled, framed, and spoken about, rarely spoken to. The world became used to hearing about Iran through the lens of threat and instability, a nation to manage or contain. But when Iran struck back, not with empty noise, but with deliberate, unapologetic action, it disrupted that entire framework. It wasn't the act itself that shocked the world. It was the calm in which it was done. There were no fiery speeches, no reckless escalation, just a calculated demonstration that Iran was done playing defense. In that moment, Iran did something few expected. It made the world rethink everything it assumed. Not just about Iran, but about global politics in general. The power dynamic many believed to be permanent suddenly looked vulnerable. If a sanctioned, cornered, and repeatedly threatened nation could make such a bold move and stand by it with confidence, what else had the world misunderstood? This wasn't just a military or political retaliation. It was an announcement that sovereignty still matters, that self-respect still exists, and that nations, no matter how isolated they are portrayed to be, can still rise. This deeply affected how people outside the Western sphere saw the event. For many, Iran became more than just a country resisting pressure. It became a symbol of dignity, a nation not begging for acceptance, but demanding recognition. In countries that have also faced foreign interference or have felt the sting of global double standards, Iran's defiance resonated. It wasn't about ideology, it was about identity, about standing firm when the world tells you to bow. What followed was not just political debate, but a wave of silent respect. People may have disagreed with Iran's politics, but many couldn't ignore the courage it displayed. That's rare in international affairs, when a nation's act transcends strategy and speaks directly to human instincts, dignity, pride, and the refusal to be humiliated. Iran's move became a reminder that no matter how dominant one side appears, the spirit of resistance cannot be erased. Sometimes it only takes one firm stance to reset the conversation, and Iran had just done that. International media scrambled to make sense of Iran's bold defiance, but many failed to capture the deeper undercurrents at play. For the average observer, it may have seemed like another episode in a long, standing regional conflict. But for those paying closer attention, it was far more than that. Iran wasn't just retaliating, it was rewriting the rules of engagement. In the past, every act of resistance was met with disproportionate global condemnation. But this time, Iran didn't just brace for backlash. It owned the moment. It didn't wait to be portrayed by foreign headlines. Instead, it became the narrator of its own story. That alone shifted the energy around global discourse. Suddenly, it was Iran explaining its position, its reasoning, and its strategy, and the world had no choice but to listen. What made this moment even more profound was the way it exposed the double standards often present in global politics. Many countries have exercised military or political power across borders without ever facing the moral scrutiny Iran consistently faces. Yet when Iran stood up for itself, it was immediately met with outrage from the very nations that had long asserted similar force abroad. This time, however, Iran didn't flinch. It didn't explain itself apologetically. It spoke directly, calmly, and unapologetically, and that composure unnerved many. Because power, when paired with control, speaks volumes. Iran wasn't trying to win a war. It was trying to win the narrative, and to a large extent, it succeeded. Across the global south and in parts of the Middle East, the reaction was one of subtle admiration. Iran had reminded smaller nations that strength doesn't always come from allies or weapons, but from clarity, unity, and belief in your own cause. That's why its actions sparked not just political analysis, but philosophical reflection. What does it mean to defend sovereignty in an age where narratives are tightly controlled? How does a nation maintain pride when it's constantly under attack, politically, economically, and socially? Iran's answer wasn't found in press conferences or flashy declarations. It was found in quiet defiance, in its refusal to be cornered without response. This was a reminder that every nation has a red line, and Iran had just shown the world exactly where its own stood. In doing so, it didn't just protect its interests. It restored a sense of self, worth that many thought had been buried beneath decades of sanctions and isolation. As reactions poured in from around the globe, it became clear that Iran's defiance had triggered more than just diplomatic statements. It had shaken the emotional foundation of many who had long felt voiceless in a world dominated by a handful of powerful states. For people across the Middle East, Africa, Asia, and beyond, Iran's stance wasn't merely about geopolitics. It represented something deeply personal, a cry for respect, a demand to be seen, a refusal to keep shrinking under the weight of decades of pressure. This wasn't about promoting conflict, it was about reclaiming space. Iran's message resonated because it said what many nations and people wish they could say enough. What made this act even more powerful was the psychological shift it created. For years, Iran had been framed as isolated, surrounded, boxed in. But suddenly, it appeared centered, grounded, and unwavering. The balance of fear had shifted. It was no longer just about what Iran might do. It was about how far others were willing to go in response, knowing full well that Iran would not be bullied. That clarity changed the game. It placed pressure not on Iran, but on those who had built their strategies around its submission. Iran had redefined its identity, not just for others, but for its own people. The youth who had grown up under sanctions, who had only known a world where their country was portrayed as the problem, now saw a different reflection, one of confidence, sovereignty, and unflinching will. international observers were left with questions they hadn't expected to ask. What does it mean when a so-called isolated nation can act with such self-assurance? What happens when the narrative begins to crumble, not because of a weapon or war, but because of clarity and conviction? Iran didn't need global approval in that moment. It needed only to show that it had not been broken. The symbolic power of that moment reached far beyond borders. For oppressed voices, for silenced nations, for individuals living under occupation or pressure, it became a source of quiet strength. Iran hadn't just pushed back on military terms. It had pushed back against the belief that might is always right. And in doing so, it had opened a new chapter in global resistance, one that speaks in calm tones, but carries the force of decades of restraint finally transformed into resolve. Perhaps the most unexpected impact of Iran's defiance was the silence that followed. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of reflection. The global powers who once responded with immediate threats and coordinated outrage found themselves hesitating. Behind closed doors, strategies were being reassessed, calculations were shifting. The assumption that Iran would always play by the rules others had set, rules that rarely favored it, was no longer valid. Iran had demonstrated something rare in modern geopolitics: the strength to respond without unraveling, the power to strike without losing control. It had claimed its place not just as a regional force, but as a sovereign nation unwilling to be treated as anything less. This changed the way global diplomacy approached Iran. It was no longer a matter of how to contain Iran, but how to engage with it, seriously and respectfully. The world had seen a country that had been cornered for years refuse to bow, and in doing so, it had gained a form of leverage that couldn't be earned through alliances or arms deals. It came from within, from a sense of identity and history that couldn't be erased by isolation or propaganda. Iran had reminded the world that true strength isn't in how loud a country can be, but in how calm it remains under pressure. On a human level, this inspired millions. People who had long watched the news feeling helpless suddenly felt a strange hope. Iran's move wasn't just about missiles or messages. It was about reclaiming dignity. And dignity, when displayed on the world stage, is contagious. It gives others permission to believe again. To believe that justice isn't just a word used in speeches, but a goal worth standing for. That nations don't have to trade their pride for peace. They can demand both. What began as a moment of retaliation became a message of restoration. Iran didn't change the world overnight, but it reminded the world that change begins with courage. That sometimes, all it takes is one act of fearless defiance to disrupt a pattern of control. And while analysts may continue to debate the politics of it all, those watching from the margins understood something far deeper. Iran had spoken for more than just itself. It had spoken for everyone who's ever been told to stay silent, sit down, and accept less. And that message was heard loud and clear. Iran's defiance wasn't just a headline, it was a turning point. In a world where power is often measured by alliances, weapons, or wealth, Iran reminded everyone that dignity, resolve, and identity are even stronger currencies. It stood firm not to provoke, but to say, "We will not be ignored. We will not be reduced." That message, whether celebrated or criticized, echoed far beyond borders and governments. It reached the hearts of ordinary people. People tired of watching nations be pushed into silence. People longing for justice, for respect, for truth. This was more than geopolitics. It was a spiritual moment for many, a reminder that when you stand on principle, even the mightiest forces must pause. Whether one agrees or not with Iran's methods, the deeper point is undeniable. It reclaimed its voice, and through that, gave others hope to find theirs. Thank you for watching and supporting this platform, where we explore stories the world often overlooks. If this video spoke to something inside you, something bigger than politics, then share it. Let the world know you're listening. And above all, stay thoughtful, stay aware, and never stop asking the deeper questions.